share it later. Okay. So I will start, and if someone joins, it will join. Well, thank you for connecting today, and remember that that today we have this. Basically, today I'm going to talk a bit about the project, my project, Marie Curie, that it actually is entitled Metacommunities and the Role of Habitat Networks in Safeguarding Against Biodiversity Loss Under Fragmentation and Environmental Stress. It's very long, so we kind of shorten it up with Sophie by the name of MetaHeroes. We will see it later. But before going deeply on the project thing, I wanted also I thought that it was also interesting to talk about what I've been doing or from where I'm coming, kind of, to give a bit of context on what is actually the bit going to do. Because actually I was thinking about it, and it's really my thesis and the previous works kind of echo towards the MetaHeroes project and what we are going to do. So I thought that it's interesting to go through this a bit fast and later deepen on show you what I'm going to do. So first, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of my parkour and my existential parkour. But I will go very fast. I don't want to go into the details. Basically, I did my bachelor's in the University of Girona that later derivated to my thesis also in the University of Girona in the Aquatic Ecology Institute from there. I did my thesis with Stephanie Gascon and Danny Boyce, that you probably have read or heard about them, that mostly work with temporary ponds in all this area. But during my thesis, I also went to Uruguay in La Universidad de la República with Ana Inés Bortagaray and Matías Arín. At the beginning was just for a 3-month stay, but then it became kind of bigger, and they got inside the thesis more than what was expected at the beginning, which was super cool because they contributed a lot. So basically, this was kind of my PhD parkour. And after that, I went to a place that you probably have heard about also, which is Lunds, within the Aquascale group with Robert Tachnik, with a postdoctoral contract within the Aquacosm Plus for 1 year. After that, I moved towards Barcelona, the University of Barcelona, with Miguel Cañedo and Núria Bonada, and actually from there I switched towards rivers, and I work with temporary rivers within the Mecodisper project, also with a short postdoctoral contract that kind of led to what I was just doing before arriving here, which was a Margarita Salas fellowship, which is kind of a small project from the government of Spain, where I kind of combined my stay with Uruguay and my stay with Barcelona to do a project that we called Dendrinet, where I got also in relationship with the Driver project, which is kind of a big intermittent rivers project in Europe, and also the Ponderful, that this is probably one that you have heard about it. I mentioned these two because there will be some things that I will show to you that are related to, especially the Ponderful one. And now we are in 2023. I am arriving to Budapest to start the MetaHeroes project, which is a Marie Curie fellowship, and I will do it here in the Aquatic Institute with the Metacomlab, with Sophie, and also with Jonathan Chase and Ana Bortagaray and Matías. As you can see, the Uruguay part is kind of popping up throughout history. But I'm not talking about the postdoctoral contracts and stuff. I want to talk a bit more about what I actually did. During my beginning of the thesis, I worked mostly with macroinvertebrates from temporary ponds from the Iberian, the northeastern part of the Iberian Peninsula, so from Girona. And then during my thesis, I tried to kind of move up this to a more ecological point of view, thinking more about how disturbances can impact these communities and how network structure can help to recover or influences the recovery of these communities. Basically, we had some ponds that were affected by a wildfire, and then throughout my thesis, I kind of tried to understand what were the impacts of wildfire and how the structure of the network was helping these ponds or these systems to recover after that. Later, during my postdoctoral contract, I switched from temporary ponds to alpine lakes and planktonic communities, but also working with network structure and how this influences diversity. Also, I focused during some time also on freshwater salinization as a disturbance. So instead of wildfire, I was talking more or looking, in this case was more a review, it was not a field work, but it was related to freshwater salinization. Then, during my parkour in Barcelona, I worked with intermittent streams And that means that they dry at some point during summer, or at some point they are dry, and the impact that this has also at the network and also diversity scale. And then during my Margarita Salas fellowship, which at the end is a bit mixed with my stay in Barcelona, we kind of developed this to understand better the spatiotemporal connectivity patterns of intermittent streams and to bring some of these ideas into a bigger simulation scale models. I don't know, some of you were on the ASLO talk. It's the talk that I gave them. It's kind of part of the work that we did together with Uruguay and Barcelona inside the Ponderful. So this is a bit kind of this story that if we try to summarize a bit is at the end, I've been working with several types of systems that have different types of structures and dynamics, especially also temporally. But at the end, the main topics have always been kind of these two layers and the resilience of aquatic metacommunities, which actually is kind of the title of my thesis, but that has remained throughout time. Basically, we have these two layers, the disturbance and the network structure. And sometimes at the end, I realized somehow that I am always thinking on some kind of disturbance, some kind of perturbation, say salinization, drying, landscape degradation. That is somehow impacting our communities. And then I am looking how this community responds, thinking on the network structure that binds them, either the pond network, the lake network, the spatiotemporal connectivity network, or networks more at the bigger European scale or the structure. So at the end, I'm always looking at how a disturbance is impacting a community and throughout the network structure is changing their diversity patterns or not. So it's kind of these two layers all the time. Of course, all this is framed within metacommunity theory with graph and network theory and with null and neutral simulations. These three elements are kind of the theory that kind of envelopes all this conceptualization of things, let's say. So I know that we are in the Metacomlab, so talking about metacommunities is a bit redundant somehow, and you are all know about it, but I will go just rapidly on these three topics before to enter the core part of the MetaHeroes project that you will see. Basically, at the end, in my idea, and at the end, we have to imagine here a pond, which is the beginning of the whole history at the end, and some organisms that at the end are impacted by a disturbance that can be defined as a discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, blah, blah, that basically affects or impacts the local conditions of that habitat, no? And then it changes the abundance, the present absence of some organisms there. But of course, this we have to frame it within a region. And some of these elements of some of these habitats of this region can be impacted and some others not. Therefore, changing the local impacts can get also transmitted at the regional scale. So the regional conditions can also be impacted by this type of disturbance. Therefore, at the end, when we are talking about local things and the interaction at the regional scale, or let's say the meta part of this interaction, we are always inside the meta-communities framework that could be defined as labeled, set, blah, blah, as linked communities linked by dispersal of multiple potential interacting species. This is like 20 years ago. Now this has been reframed a lot, and I really like this figure of the meta-community theory that was published not so long ago, because it really summarizes kind of the three main axes that we are always dealing with, no? And actually, I tried to play a bit and to put a bit these conceptual things that I was telling you on how I have understood meta-communities throughout this time. Like we have the disturbance that somehow would impact everything or could potentially impact everything, let's say the biotic, the abiotic, or the landscape structure. And then I'm always focusing, or I have been focusing mostly on this part using the network structure. So on the dispersal part using my network structure, either of rivers, either of ponds, either of lakes, whatever. Of course, at the end, networks and all these ideas can be also transmitted to abiotic or biotic parts. And actually, we have done something with graphical lassos and network analysis of traits, or we are starting to do something trying to bring networks also to these other axes. But today we are focusing, or we're talking more, and I have been working mostly with network structure linked to dispersal. Talking about networks, the way in which we conceptualize this, I think that you have done already some works in relation to that, but at the end, we have a network of ponds, and we assume that dispersal is possible between these ponds. And this can be transmitted into a graph or a network. But at the end is the tool that helps us understand how dispersal works. Of course, as a tool, it can be constructed in several ways. At the end, what we always have is X and Y coordinates of points. Then how do we make all this become a network is much more complex. Because of course we can decide, this is very nice, this is a very nice picture, it looks quite interesting, but at the end, depending on how we build our network based on the threshold distance, we can generate different types of networks. And each type of network will show us different landscape structures that at the end can be related to how an organism is moving throughout this landscape. For example, this one looks very fragmented, but actually would be more similar to what a snail would perceive that it's only able to move into a small part of the network or just a nearby system. So how do we construct this network is a question that has always been somehow popping up in these researches or all the things that I have done so far. Another problem or question that I've been dealing with is the scale. Let's imagine that we have this Europe, the Alps, we have several lakes in the middle of the Alps. So we say, okay, let's look how the network looks like. No, let's make a buffer area and see all the lakes that are around these sampled lakes, and let's build it. We see it's 600 kilometers, whatever, and we build up a network. Oh, so cool, it's super interesting. But this is kind of an arbitrary choice. We could think of making it at 300 kilometers, we can make it 100 kilometers, 60 or 6. And as you can see, the network or the structure that we will be generating out of that would strongly differ, especially between the 300 and 100 and then even lower. So the scale at which we work and at which we build this network, it's also relevant. It's always a big question also in ecology, you always know where we have the boundaries of our system. But it's also important when we build a network. Also, another point is, okay, this is a photo of the moment, but actually systems change. And we that work in temporary ponds know it better than anything. Things change throughout time. And for example, spatiotemporal connectivity in rivers, that is more easy because it happens every year constantly. It's also something complex that we work in Barcelona, for example, to try to have values to quantify how things disconnect and connect throughout the year. And then related with alpha and beta diversity patterns. But all these questions somehow are related to this network structure and how we build this network structure. Because at the end, yes, we have a meaning for the links, that is an effective path between two communities, and the nodes, that is a defined community, let's say a pond or a patch of forest or whatever. But later, how we set up the other features of this network is also key in order to understand how, in order to answer the question that we want to ask to this network. Of course, is what I said, you can also bring this to biotic or abiotic communities, parts of the assemblies. To finish, we kind of have built up, no? We have the meta community things, we understand them through networks, but then we can play with these networks and use null and neutral simulations to kind of ask questions that later we get answered. For this, we will kind of slow down a bit and try to go through what I understand by a simulation, because it's not always as clear as it says. Neutral theory is something that we kind of know, we have heard about it, is where we assume that extinction, dispersal, and speciation is somehow just a matter of chance. There is nothing in terms of environment that is filtering out our communities. It's just a matter of flipping a coin, and then someone gets elected and dies, and someone gets elected and is born or is dispersing. If we kind of make a very easy example, if we have a community at time 1, do you see my stuff, no? My degree? I don't know how to say it. It's the laser one. If we have a community at one moment, and we have some individuals of black and white, two species, the white species and the black species. And at some point, there is a disturbance that kills part of these organisms. So it generates a difference, but randomly selecting them. There is no reason why you die or not. It's just a matter of chance. If then we recolonize these empty spots of this community, by chance also, there is possibilities that, for example, as there is more blacks, as there is more whites than blacks, there will be more probability to have a white than a black, and therefore, once we recolonize, there will be more whites than blacks than it was before. But even we could get the chance that a gray species appear either because it's generated, either because it arrives from a neighboring community. So if we repeat this kind of disturbance cycle idea, many times we kill several organisms and then we remake a colonization pattern, we kind of generate we can generate a diversity pattern that is responding on some of the characteristics of this community. Okay, like how many neighbors do you have, how easy is to recolonize an habitat, etc. And actually, we have a better image of a community, not just a square. We have a network already. We have created it. So actually, we can, based on the spatial location of ponds and their areas, we can try to play with this kind of idea to simulate diversity patterns linked to this network structure. Basically, if we have location of communities and their areas, we can assume that there will be bigger communities and bigger areas, which means that there will be more empty spots to fill in a bigger area, in a bigger community than in a smaller. And later we can also assume that the farther you are, the less chances you have to recolonize or to arrive into a new community. No? Basically, once we have somehow, so at the end, if you are closer, you have higher migration probability. If you are farther, you have a smaller migration probability. The weight of the link at the end, it depends on the distance between the two sides and also of the size of the communities. Bigger communities will be able to share or give more propagules to their neighbors. So if we try to zoom in one of these networks, and we, for example, happen to see several communities that are in line, it's just an example, and we want to focus on what is happening in the red one, we say, okay, let's begin to try to play with it. No? We have the red community, and we see that there is some communities that are closer, so the migration probability is higher than the ones that are far. We also know that, of course, if there is organisms inside this community, there is a probability also that an organism inside of the community has kids and therefore fills the gaps that are inside this community. So then if we begin from scratch, we don't have anything in our simulation. So we need to put something inside. So at time 0, we kind of throw one species randomly selected inside all our communities. In this case, there is an orange species that ends up in our red community. Okay. And then we start the iterations, this thing of filling and filling and filling and filling that I was telling you. Basically, what we do, we ask who have chances to arrive there. And based on that, we also say who is able to have kids in this red community. So at time 1, we say, okay, let's ask the question. Do the orange have occupies an empty space, or is someone coming from the neighboring pool that is determined by who is closer and who is far? We flip the coin, and suddenly we have a green species arriving in our community. At time 2, we flip again the coin, and in this case, it's the green species who had a kid and filled a gap. If we repeat this several times, at some point we fill our community based on the signal that we have from the neighbors and the structure of the landscape. So we generate a local community. This is what we call coalescent biodiversity model. And actually, this is something that we have used, for example, with Anna and Matthias, to compare between what is important to consider in the landscape. If we look at only permanent habitats, permanent water habitats by themselves, we obtain a diversity signal. But if we look at the permanent habitats, richness, but consider also the connectivity that is related to other types of habitat, we can also get a different type of richness signal. And at the end, this we saw that, for example, if we take into account the whole waterscape and not only one type of habitat, we can get higher diversity. Therefore, preserving the whole waterscape is as important as preserving just one type of habitat, because we are fostering the capacity of organisms to move throughout the landscape by preserving other types of habitat. But we can still go further and use lottery to shape even more these diversity patterns that we are obtaining. What does it mean? Basically, flipping more coins. If we imagine that we have our habitat, our communities that I was showing to you, that zoom, in this case, it's in a different distribution, but it doesn't matter. After we have our community built up and filled with all the organisms that I showed you before, we just generate random death, births, and colonization. So basically, we flip a coin and we say some individuals of some species of each one of our habitats will die, will disappear. And then there will be a colonization following the dynamics that I told you. And then we will repeat this several times. By doing this, we are kind of forcing these dynamics and making some species go extinct, some species recolonize, always based on the connections that we have in our network. So if you are very central, you will tend to have more colonization events, and therefore colonization will be stronger, and you will tend to become more and more homogeneous. While if you are isolated, the probabilities will be that you will be feeling yourself, your community, because there will be less neighbors in this community. So by doing this, we kind of generate a diversity signal, and then the cool part is that we can play with it. And for example, simulate wildfires and say, okay, so some of the ponds of our landscape will get burned, and then they will need to be recolonized. And then we can say, okay, if we reproduce a landscape wildfire, so a disturbance, equally as it was in the real world, we can see which species were impacted and were not. In this case, the ones that have a 1 were the ones able to recolonize, and the ones that are below 1, so these ones here, were not able to recolonize. So they were having less chances to recolonize after a wildfire or taking longer times. But the cool part is that we can design scenarios, and that's an interesting point. So we can imagine that that we have very, very big fires with huge intensities and run these models several times and see which is the diversity that we could expect at different gradients of this disturbance. And in this case, it's extreme, but we see that some species will be able to recolonize no matter the problems. Blue colors means high species, high recovery, while others will never be able to recover, in this case, very passive dispersal. But there is in between points where we observe a switch in you are able to recolonize, but then you are not able to recolonize. So there is kind of a threshold of intensity and area. And this threshold is the interesting point that you can play with. You will say, David, now you're just talking about yourself. Really relax. We are here to hear about meta community things. But the interesting point is that by doing this, we are able to generate different scenarios and play with them to imagine futures and therefore the trends that diversity might send about it. You might remind these images that I'm putting here from the Axolotl. There, what we did is basically simulate diversity throughout landscape degradation scenarios at the whole European level, and then obtain values and measures out of that. But the cool thing of that is that later we can see which regions at the European level are more sensitive or less sensitive to fragmentation or landscape degradation. Having said all this, you would be asking why you are saying all this to us, why you are explaining all these points of your and these papers that you went super fast and etc. But the point is that all these main ideas are somehow embedded in the MetaHeroes project, because we kind of pushed forward, or we will push forward all these ideas to try to trigger and better understand what is driving or how fragmentation is impacting community assembly. Because we have these two layers, we will have network structure and disturbance. Basically, we focus in our case in fragmentation and therefore the loss of habitat in a landscape, but also the change in the structure of this habitat. As you can see here, for example, the red center that will be more central sites is shifting towards more to the middle. So ponds that were at one point central are becoming more isolated in this simulated thing. It's not true data. But then we add also a disturbance or a specific disturbance or environmental disturbance, which is freshwater salinization in this project. So we have fragmentation, but also salinization or the change in salinity as two main impacts. On what? On ponds or in systems like ponds that you maybe know better than anyone, which are mesocosms. So in this project, what we will use is fragmentation, salinization, apply it into ponds as our example, or mesocosms that are like very small ponds, to ask this question. Of course, considering differences on dispersal and kind of mirroring these differences on dispersal through network structures. So different dispersal abilities will result in different network structures that at the end will help to cope or not with salinization, or will make communities more weak against salinization, because there will be a loss of connectivity also. But trying to frame the whole picture at the end is what I will show, what I have been showing to you more or less. We have a community, we have a pond or habitat and network of them, and somehow they are impacted by two main stressors. First one is fragmentation, the loss of habitat that is weakening, or if it's not fragmentation and it's winning of connectivity, for example, maybe is making the network more strong against other disturbances, in our case, the salinity. This is kind of the main overarching figure of the whole Metacommunities MetaHero project. But let's go to a bit more deep and show each one of these parts. So the main objective is somehow to understand the consequences and interaction of connectivity loss and local stressor, parentheses, salinity, for biodiversity in habitat networks, and then assess, and that's maybe one of the most important, the role of connectivity in maintaining community resistance against disturbances. So I am talking all the time about fragmentation, but at the end, we are trying to kind of flip it and say, okay, what if we, instead of assuming that everything will get fragmented, think on how we can avoid this fragmentation in the best way possible to kind of preserve diversity. Basically, this MetaHeroes project at the end is, and this main objective is organized in 3 main work packages. The first one is an experimental test, basically trying to ask this question of connectivity safeguarding communities against salinity stress. And what we will do is an experiment using mesocosms and planktonic communities in order to somehow simulate a gradient of community and a gradient of salinity tolerances. Basically, we have something that you already know quite well. And the idea is to simulate gradients of connectivity and salinity, as I said. The main objective is to somehow quantify the relevance of connectivity against a salinity impact or an increase and a change in salinization. And well, we expect that more connected sites, well-connected sites will be higher, will have higher species richness, and therefore will be more resistant to the impact of, or will be able to recover fast after the salinization impact. That communities with more saline, from more saline habitats will be able to cope better with the salinization impact. And at the end, that salt tolerance and connectivity will have kind of a multiplicative effect. So if you are used to salt and you are very central, the impact of salinity will be very small because you are able to cope with these disturbances. To show you a bit the main idea, and going fast, our point was to simulate different degrees at the beginning. Different degrees of dispersal, and having communities from the 3 different origins, from more freshwater communities and from more saline communities, and something in the middle. And then generate different replicates of mesocosms for each one of these crossed values. Then at some point, simulate the salinization impact, so an increase in salinization on these mesocosms, which requires a control, of course, and then sample this in a weekly basis, for example, or something like this through time. As you can see, this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So at some point with Jofi, we were starting to think already that maybe we could reduce and just work with 2 extremes, like very disconnected, more connected, strongly saline communities, strongly freshwater or more freshwater communities, and actually move it in a step further. And instead of moving water every day to simulate higher colonization, put the mesocosms in a truly centrality isolation gradient. So in a place such as the bomb crater, for example. This is always also, these are all still in progress ideas, but this could be a possibility. So to work with 2 extremes, freshwater and saline, and only isolated and central communities, and bring the mesocosms in the network. So not have to simulate centrality isolation, just let them be colonized or less inside the natural centrality isolation gradient. Of course, then at some point, some of the mesocosms will get impacted, and we will, of course, follow this process. What we could expect would be that in red background, we will have saline communities, so used to salinization. In blue background, we have non-used or more freshwater communities. And then the darker blue are more central communities. The clearer blue are more isolated communities that throughout time, more central have higher richness, more isolated have a smaller richness. And once they are impacted, they react differently depending if they are used to salinization, then they are not that much impacted. If they are not used, the impact is bigger. This is just an hypothetical expectation. Probably it will be like this when we do the experiment. Sure. This I will do it here with you. And I think that it's very important to, or mostly inside the group here. And actually, the point of this talk also and to talk is to say to you that the doors are open to participate in this part of the project, and the others also, but in this one especially, because I truly believe that you are much more expert now than me in Metacomlab working and progress of this. And actually, as I said, this is an experiment that we are just designing. So there is possibility of all of us to co-design it together and think what could be better, what could be worse, and think of what could be work better or not, especially after the experience that you already had during this summer with this bigger experimental setting. So I think that if you want to join, it's like doors are open to participate, and we will start next week maybe to meet, to talk about how do we design, what do we do, what do we measure, etc. So doors are open in this sense. You are more than welcome, and I would say even you are more than needed for having a successful experience. But it's not all of that. There is still other work packages to do. The work package 2 is an empirical long-term study. You probably have already seen this figure. There is the soda pans. I don't remember now exactly the name in Hungarian, but I think that we are all located in the place. Basically, in the paper or the work from Shofi, they had two moments in time. So the past 1950s and the 2010s. But actually, there is an in-between point with also samples, not of the entire community, but of part of the community that we will use in this experiment, in this work package. Basically, we have a community that we have 3 photos of a community and of the landscape, which is perfect. And basically what we expect, what we were trying to assess will be the effects of fragmentation on diversity through time. In this case, it's kind of a field experiment question. And what we will expect is at the end that the collapse of diversity will be stronger or not, depending on the fragmentation, and that at the end, you will lose a species. This is kind of an obvious or could be an expected response, but actually, if we think about it, we don't know how the trajectory of this loss of diversity will be, and it will depend on the loss of habitat, how the habitat has been disappearing throughout time. Actually, I was starting to play a bit with the data already, and you can see that there is kind of a decrease of diversity in rough numbers, and really like not, but you can see that there is somehow a decrease on diversity, that in the middle there is kind of a stronger loss than by the end. And actually, when you look a bit deeper, I'm not going to put on that, you see that there is gains and losses and losses and gains for this disappearance or just loss of a species. So it's not that easy as, look, there is a line that is going down. This is something that we will work further. But so far, the interesting point is that we have clearly, this is the soda pans network. So we see that, and also the purple points are more centrality, yellow is less. So we see that there is a change in the structure of the network. But the point that we were thinking these days is actually that we can somehow use those flipping coin things that I was explaining to you to somehow simulate the diversity signal that responds to losing the habitat in a determined way, losing it very strongly at the beginning and losing less strongly at the end, or losing not strongly at the beginning and suddenly losing all the habitat in one moment. This could give us a signal of diversity or different signals of diversity that we can compare with ones that we have, and somehow say, okay, so what we think is that even if we don't have images, the landscape has been disappearing in this sense, and this has had this similar impact or this impact in our communities. This we will do, I will do it. So, I mean, everything I will do it here, but with the collaboration of Jonathan Chase in the idea that either I will go there or we have to specify this still. And at the end, and I'm finishing already, the work package 3, which is the strongly modeling part or the modeling fragmentation stress in randomized scenarios. What does this mean? Basically, what we want to try is from the information or the knowledge that we will develop from work package 1 and 2, we want to try to move forward, because we are always talking about fragmentation and how bad it is. It's like, no, let's ask the question in another way. What, even if everything gets messed, how we can optimize this loss of diversity and kind of counteract it and think on what we should preserve at the network scale, what we should add, what we should improve in order to preserve diversity. And for this, we will use, of course, all the information that we gathered and try to move towards a more wider scale schema, either using data from Hungary, other European countries of whole Europe, whatever, but basically basing our approximation with land cover and the projection of this land cover that are already available under different developmental scenarios. For example, projection A would be business as usual. Projection B would be everything gets destroyed and the world is industrialized at maximum. Projection C will be, we preserve some stuff and we developmental goals, etc. Everything goes green, to give you extreme example. Basically, what we want to stress with that is like we generate several fragmentation scenarios, but then we try to generate future scenarios of habitat loss and its conservation. And this is the key point, expecting that preserving parts of this network or improving or conserving some parts will improve our diversity. At the end, what we will do, or what we are thinking to do, is that in these simulations, we can also make that some species are adapted to some type of filters or not, or land covers in our case. So we have different land covers and some species that are better in some of these land covers, and we have the change on these land covers throughout time. We can somehow put all these in the shaker of this model and generate one baseline model that is responding to how the filters will change throughout time, filters and its distribution into the landscape. But the cool thing is that then we can say, okay, let's preserve some part of this, let's improve some part of this, let's add some part or new habitats. And this can generate also diversity signals that then we can compare between them and somehow assess which strategy is more important, or which strategy could be better, or which combination of strategies could be better to somehow maintain or not lose that much diversity. This, of course, is still under construction, but will be something that we will do together with Anna and Matthias, that maybe at some point will come to visit us here in Budapest. But that is really promising and very interesting. And somehow it's linked to part of the wonderful things that we have been developing with Anna and Matthias until now, but now we want to push further with the MetaHeroes project. So basically, this is kind of the global picture of the whole MetaHeroes. Especially and strongly, this is good for the work package 1, and so join the team and help us. But later there is all this overview that is kind of linking with these main ideas that I already talked to you. I am finishing. Thank you so much for hearing me. And of course, something that I want to stress is like, I am talking about MetaHeroes, I'm talking about myself. I really don't like to talk about myself and stuff, but feel free to contact me, to write me, to talk with me in person. If you have doubts about your stuff that I would really love to hear about your thesis or projects or whatever more in detail. So I'm happy to just have a coffee and talk about what you're going to do, what are your problems, because I'm here also to kind of exchange in both ways, kind of. So just, and voila. And I am stopping the recording.